Few characters have seen as many movie and TV adaptations as Dracula. Since he first appeared in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, his popularity slowly grew out from literary circles before it expanded with stage plays from the mid-1920s onwards, and then exploded into the mainstream with the 1931 adaptation from Universal Studios, starring Bela Lugosi. Only then did Dracula become a household name. From there, the eponymous vampire would appear in many more Universal pictures, which became ever more comedic, until he was made scary again in the 1950s by Christoper Lee in the Hammer horror films. All of these adaptations, however, deviated from Bram Stoker's original novel in major ways. It wasn't until the 1970 version by Jess Franco that a serious attempt was made to stay true to the source material, which indeed is what prompted Christoper Lee to return to the role. But half a century before that, there was one adaptation which, however, inadvertently stayed more true to the original vampire mythos than any other, and that would be F.W. Murnau's 1922 classic Nosferatu. There's irony in that, because it's an unofficial adaptation, which changed the name of not only Dracula, but all the other characters as well. Indeed, something went so wrong here that the movie was disowned by Bram Stoker's widow, who sought to have every copy of it destroyed. But something else went right, because the movie still lived on to be more influential than perhaps any other Dracula adaptation. It even added to the vampire mythos, as well as the history and evolution of cinema. And it has even been honored with itself getting remade, and more than once. So how did any of that happen? Why did a small German production company end up making an unofficial adaptation of an English novel in the first place? What is the movie's alleged connection to the occult? And does it, as has been claimed by some, have any ties to the more troubling parts of German history? Most importantly, how could a movie where almost every copy was destroyed go on to be so influential? We are about to find out all of that and more in this ultimate Nosferatu retrospective. Let's dive in. The original 1922 Nosferatu isn't technically the first adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The Austrian Dracula Halala was released a few months earlier, but all copies of it have been lost, while a 1920 Russian adaptation of Stoker's novel is only rumored to ever have existed at all, as there's no tangible evidence that it ever did. This makes Nosferatu the oldest extant adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The history of Nosferatu doesn't begin with either Bram Stoker or Dracula though, but with German artist, architect and occultist Albin Grau. Many may associate the movie more with director Murnau today, but the one individual without whom the movie Nosferatu could never have happened was producer Albin Grau. Born in Leipzig-Schönefeld in 1884, Grau was a lifelong student of the occult and an eventual member of the Fraternitas Saturni, a magical order centered around astrological and Luciferian teachings. He also served in the German army during World War I, and during the winter of 1916 he encountered Slavic folklore when a Serbian farmer told him that his father was a vampire and one of the undead. The farmer's story and details surrounding it stuck with Grau, and he has stated that it was this which inspired him to do a vampire film, which indeed he would do only 5 years later. By that time, World War I was over, and Grau had become an established architect and artist, as well as a practicing occultist. To wit, alongside Enrico Deichmann, he founded the film studio Prana Films in 1921 with the intention of producing occult and supernatural-themed films. Underlining that point, the name Prana was taken from a theosophical journal, Theosophy being the occult order formed around the teachings of Madame Blavatsky, and that journal in turn had lifted the name from the Hindu concept of prana, the force that connects all things. On that note, if you want to stay connected, and you find the information presented here to be interesting, then why not like this video and hit subscribe, and indicate you want notifications on all videos, as there will be plenty more deep dives like this to come. For now though, let's return to Nosferatu. For Prana's first feature film then, Albin Grau, inspired by the story he learned from the Serbian farmer during World War I, wanted to make a vampire movie, and there already was a perfect template for one, namely Bram Stoker's Dracula. To be clear, Albin Grau never had any intention of doing a completely faithful adaptation of the book, nor did he want his vampire to be anything like the elegant and aristocratic Dracula. What he wanted was to use the story of a young real estate broker traveling from the modern world the audience knew to the faraway ancient land of Transylvania, where he would encounter a medieval supernatural evil beyond his understanding, and for that supernatural evil to invade the modern world the audience knew. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, the modern world ultimately conquered the revenant of the medieval past. But to Albin Grau, the appeal was the idea of this ancient evil bringing rats and pestilence into the modern world, triggering Jungian memories of a shared past, and for the ancient world to, in a sense, win and corrupt modernity to the point of resorting to human sacrifice, the only way it can prevail. This indeed is the major thematic difference between Bram Stoker's Dracula and Nosferatu. Since Grau was making a German movie for German audiences, the movie's familiar home location was moved from Whitby, England, where Bram Stoker's novel was set, to the fictional but familiar German town of Wisborg. More extensive changes were needed though, and to help him put them into words, Grau recruited writer and fellow occultist Henrik Galeen, who had just written Der Golem. He was tasked with assisting Grau in taking the core storyline of Bram Stoker's book, but rewriting it to fit Grau's vision of a Jungian nightmare, and to this end, make it better align with folklore as well as occult practice and tradition. One of the first things to go was the title, not in a conscious effort to dodge copyright. Bram Stoker's Dracula was always credited as the story inspiration, even in the original title cards, but because Albin Grau, a very hands-on producer, had a different title in mind, namely Nosferatu. This term was derived from an ancient Romanian word, Nesuferitu, which roughly translates as the repugnant one. This is so similar to the Greek nosophoros, meaning plague carrier, that it suggests a common Proto-Indo-European origin, or put more plainly, the term predates recorded history and the formation of modern European languages, meaning it dates back to before the Ice Age, and it always referred to a repulsive bringer of death and disease. Because of this ancient origin in prehistory, the title Nosferatu evoked shared Jungian memories, which in Grau's mind would resonate more with the German target audience at the time than would Dracula. And he was completely right about that, because remember, this is 1921. The Universal movie is still a decade in the future. Dracula's stage plays are half a decade into the future. At this time, outside of history buffs who knew of Vlad Tepes and literary types who knew Bram Stoker's book, Dracula was completely unknown to the people at large. Even the Austrian movie Dracula Halala, which would since be lost, was months away from release, and if the hypothesized Russian movie adaptation from the year before ever existed, it left zero impact anywhere. To tell the story he wanted, evoking Jungian memories, Albin Grau had to use the title Nosferatu. That was only the beginning of the changes from Stoker's novel though, and from what we today consider established vampire lore. Much of that modern lore is indeed derived from Dracula, which while inspired by Romanian folklore and history, is nonetheless a fiction written by Bram Stoker. By contrast, Albin Grau and writer Henry Galén were not just familiar with the folklore, being occultists, they incorporated what you might call authentic satanic practices and beliefs, which dated back centuries, into Nosferatu. The intertitle cards make it clear that this Nosferatu, Orlok, was created by the demon Belial, who is a lieutenant of Satan. This is significant for two reasons. First, because Belial is associated with the plague and pestilence, which, as we saw from the name itself, so is the Jungian Nosferatu. Grau and Galén connected these dots, so as we see in the movie, wherever Orlok goes, the plague follows. The other reason why Belial is significant is because he is one of the demons typically summoned in Gothic witchcraft. This implies an origin story, namely that Count Orlok was once a biological human, but one who practiced witchcraft, which it wasn't unthinkable for a medieval Eastern European count to do, and at some point he must have conjured Belial, or otherwise made some Faustian deal with the demon gone wrong. From Orlok's perspective, that is, not Belial's. But this isn't conclusive. An alternative origin is that Orlok is the result of an unholy union between a human female and the demon Belial. Either way, he springs from Belial, which is getting the short end of the stick, because there is nothing decidable about Orlok's existence. Unlike the handsome and charming upper-class ladies' man that is Bram Stoker's Dracula, Count Orlok is truly the undead, a walking cadaver with fangs for front teeth, evoking the image of a rat, the bringer of pestilence, disease, and death. And on that note, death is the only thing that awaits Orlok's victims, as unlike Stoker's Dracula, Orlok doesn't have the power to turn anyone else into vampires. Only Belial can do that. Unlike Dracula then, Orlok has no wives. He is all alone. He can still exert influence over others though, as we see with Knock, this movie's version of Renfield. The two even communicate in Enochian writing, which is what the symbols on the contracts and letters are. Enochian writing is a very real constructed language like Esperanto, only for the occult, and Albin Grau was familiar with it, so much so that he himself made those very papers we see in the movie. It may look like gibberish with some highly demonetizable symbols thrown in for good measure, but to the initiated, that writing is perfectly clear and understandable. Grau and Galén similarly changed Van Helsing from Bram Stoker's original novel. In their version, he was reimagined as Professor Bulwer, named after English playwright and novelist Edward Bulwer Lytton, the one who came up with the saying, "The pen is mightier than the sword." And yes, staying true to the recurring theme, he was also an occultist. This is actually a fun reversal though, as in the English novel, Van Helsing was German. In this German movie, his counterpart is very likely English, or of English descent. Furthermore, the movie version of Professor Bulwer is described as Paracelsian, which is also important. That means he's a follower of the alchemist Paracelsus, which in turn means he's open to the idea that astral entities may be the cause of epidemics and that blood sacrifice is needed to make them stop, which is the central theme in this movie. The modern world can't fight ancient evil. Only the ancient ways can do that. The other characters were less changed in their adaptation for German audiences. Jonathan Harker became Thomas Hutter, and he is still sent to sell a fine old mansion to a foreign count. His wife Mina Harker was changed to Ellen Hutter, but a subtle yet profound change was made to her character. She freely sacrifices herself to deceive the vampire, and thus end the plague. While often overlooked, this is another major change from Stoker's novel, and the one that encapsulates Grau's central theme. Ancient evils must be fought with ancient means. The only way to stop Nosferatu, and by implication Belial, whom he ultimately serves, is the willing blood sacrifice of a maiden who is pure of heart and soul. Nothing else will do. No stake through the heart, no crucifix, no silver, no garlic. Only blood sacrifice can end the trail of death the Nosferatu brings. Though the Paracelsian Bulwer understands it, everyone else is powerless. Only Ellen realizes what must be done and has the conviction to sacrifice herself. That makes her the most important and badass character in the movie. Every other character in Bram Stoker's novel were either written out or toned down to facilitate Ellen's journey and realization. To bring this Jungian reimagining of Bram Stoker's novel to life, producer Albin Grau chose director F.W. Murnau. Born in 1888, Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau is regarded as one of cinema's most influential filmmakers for his work in the silent era, where he practically created a language of shadows. He showed an early interest in film and was even recruited by famed German director Max Reinhardt to his acting school. This did not save him from having to serve in World War I though, where he among other things served in the German Army's Flying Corps, where he allegedly survived 8 crashes without sustaining any serious injuries. He was, however, detained in Switzerland and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war, yet even in captivity he was involved with a prisoner theater group and even wrote a script. Following the war and his release, he established his own company with actor Conrad Veidt. By the time he was offered to direct Nosferatu, he and Conrad Veidt already had made multiple films, most of which, unfortunately, are lost today. A particularly notable one here is the 1920 movie Der Januskopf, based on the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. While the movie is lost, it is known to have co-starred a young Bela Lugosi in one of his earlier roles, a full decade before he went on to embody Dracula in the Universal Pictures classic. But let's get back to 1921 and Murnau, who had just been offered to direct Nosferatu. For the role of the Nosferatu, Murnau's first choice was his production partner Conrad Veidt, but other scheduling commitments prevented him from taking on the role, thus forcing Murnau to find another vampire. For the role of Orlok, the Nosferatu, Murnau then chose the working, but at the time still unknown actor Max Schreck, a choice producer and occultist Albin Grau happily signed off on. Not only did he have the right look and acting chops for the job, the name Schreck actually means fright or horror, and to the max at that. Grau certainly didn't mind that for a movie like this. But like Knock was in the movie, Max Schreck was surrounded by rumors, albeit of a less ominous kind. Schreck was a working theater actor, but he wasn't a famous movie star, so to the German public at large, he seemed to spring up out of nowhere. Hence, in the years after the release of Nosferatu, there were rumors that he didn't actually exist, that Max Schreck was just an elaborate and punny stage name for the, at the time, much more famous actor Alfred Abel, who kind of looked like him. As cool a story as that may be, the reality is that Friedrich Gustav Maximilian Schreck, born 1879, was very much a flesh and blood human being, and not the stage name for an, at the time, much more famous actor. Max Schreck had been bitten by the acting bug early. He took acting lessons in secret as a child, and after his disapproving father died, he attended drama school and started a long career in first and foremost theatre, and from the 1920s onwards, in feature films. Making up the rest of the principal cast were Gustav von Wangenheim as Thomas Hutter, Greta Schröder as his wife Ellen, John Gotthovd as Professor Bulwer, and Alexander Granach as the realtor Knock. And on the topic of Knock. Both the character Knock and the actor playing him were Jewish. Count Orlok also has some features which are, shall we say, consistent with contemporary and less than flattering depictions of the Jewish population. When the townfolk in the movie needed someone to blame for the plague that befell them, Knock acted in a manner which meant suspicion quickly fell onto him. So, is there some kind of anti-Semitic messaging going on here? Murnau scholars are quick to point out that Murnau himself was openly gay and therefore likely to have been sympathetic with another persecuted population group. Also, if he really wanted to convey any such messaging, he wouldn't have paid a Jewish actor, but instead have another non-Jewish actor portray Knock as even more manic than Alexander Granach did. Likewise, producer Albin Grau's chosen writer Henrik Galeen wasn't just an occultist, he too was Jewish. As we have seen, many of the features about Orlok and his otherness, which may be consistent with prejudices at the time, and which some have since attributed to anti-Semitism, were there because of the occult influence, and not because of any overt anti-Semitism. The movie has also been criticized for using some of the highly demonetizable symbols seen in the Enochian writing, but it's worth noting that these were established occult symbols which wouldn't be appropriated by the German National Socialist Labour Party for a decade and a half after the movie, so those symbols didn't have the connotation when the movie was made as they got since. That being said, it is not outside the realm of possibility that the filmmakers may also have played with the prejudices of contemporary German society in order to make the experience resonate all the more with the intended target audience. Like everything else, this movie too was a product of its time and place. The movie was filmed between July and October of 1921, with Wismar and Lübeck making up the bulk of the fictional Wisborg. The movie takes place in 1838, and interestingly, most of the buildings we see in the movie would have been there in 1838, and looked largely the same then as they did when they were filmed in 1921. What is more, though renovated since, most of them are still standing to this day. Slovakia stood in for Transylvania, with the Orava castle being used as Orlok's castle. The same castle was later used as Dracula's castle in the 2020 BBC version. Murnau was a great director, but further illustrating that producer Albin Grau was really the one in the driver's seat. The sets, costumes, and even promotional art were all designed and to a large extent even made by Albin Grau himself. The movie was actually completed and ready for release already in December of 1921, but at this time, more quality movies were being made in Germany than there were quality cinemas, so it had to wait for the next available release window, which was in March of 1922, for its formal German release. The movie premiered in the Berlin Zoo, which, contrary to what it may sound like, was a high-end location for a movie premiere, and it premiered to a score by Hans Erdmann being performed by a full orchestra. Sadly, no complete copies of this score still exists, only some pages remain, although these have been incorporated into the new scores written for most releases of the movie you will find today. That aside, more money was spent on turning the premiere into a marketing event than was spent on actually making the film. The movie received widespread acclaim from the audience and critics alike, though there was some criticism as well, mostly centered around that for a horror movie, the picture was too clear and the vampire too well lit and too visible. These criticisms may seem strange to us, as we are used to seeing not just Nosferatu, but any movie from this era, with so many scratches and so much visual noise that they're virtually unwatchable without extensive restoration. And even then, they still look like crap to the untrained eye. But these movies only appear that way to us today because we're not seeing the original prints, but copies of copies of copies that had deteriorated for half a century before they were captured and preserved onto other media in any meaningful way. The damage and deterioration we associate with these movies today wasn't there when they were first displayed to the public. No, then they were pristine and in the equivalent of 4K ultra-high definition. Point is, seeing this movie upon release in 1922 would have been a sight to behold. However, due to the limited theatrical infrastructure at the time, not all that many had the time to see it before the wife of Dracula struck. Ever since the death of Bram Stoker in 1912, his widow, Florence Stoker, had struggled with money. Having sold off the rest of her husband's literary estate for a mere £450, as none of it was in print or selling, she only retained the rights to Dracula, as it was the only one of Stoker's books that was consistently selling. Now it was her only source of revenue, even though she famously disliked it. Not just because she allegedly considered it to be lowbrow schlock, but because it had given her the nickname Dracula's wife. When she learned of the movie Nosferatu, which made no secret of the fact that it was freely adapted from Bram Stoker's Dracula, she saw red, or more accurately, she saw green. When she learned of the opulent premiere, she figured these people must have money. That was something she was in short supply of, so she wanted it, and using her name and husband's connections, she took aggressive legal action to ensure she would get it. Prana Films' problem was that they had spent everything they had on making Nosferatu and gambled the rest on the opulent premiere event, hoping to catch the attention of the German and international distributors that were there at the time, though the infrastructure for selling movies wasn't. As such, selling the movie was a long, drawn-out process, taking longer than they had hoped, and Florence Stoker began her legal warfare before they had the means to pay her the go-away money she wanted. That is what changed her sight from green to red and to go scorched earth. If she couldn't have any money from the movie, then no one else would either. Prana Films voluntarily bankrupted themselves, thus ending any hopes of more occult-themed movies. And with Prana out of business and no money coming her way, Florence won ownership of the movie in 1925, and reportedly even without seeing it, without thought to monetizing it herself, Dracula's wife instead ordered every copy of it, everywhere, to be incinerated. All copies were recalled and destroyed. There is an urban legend that only one copy remained, but it is just that, an urban legend. Because of what we today would call piracy, a few copies survived in various collections and locations, and the best versions of the movie today are composites of the very best bits of them, remastered and cleaned up as much as possible by the Murnau Foundation. We will never be able to see Nosferatu in the clarity and high-definition glory that audiences were treated to upon release in 1922 though, as all of Prana's original prints were incinerated, and for that we can thank Florence Stoker, the wife of Dracula. But then again, the notoriety of the movie effectively being banned is what directly led to a number of copies in the wild being extra looked after. The idea of preservation of movies didn't really become a thing until much later, and so the majority of movies made in this era are simply lost, and that includes several of Murnau's other films, and there was never a legal ban on any of them, yet lost they were. Just like those early Doctor Who episodes the BBC willingly and wantonly taped over. For all we know, without the notoriety Florence Stoker inadvertently gave Nosferatu, it might have been completely lost to time as well, so perhaps we shouldn't judge her too harshly. The movie lived on, and she is part of its legend. Prana Films were no more, so their next planned movies never happened. Producer Albin Grau still landed on his feet though, as he was a prominent figure in the occult circles of German high society until the late 1930s, at which point he had to flee to Switzerland, as his occult society was in opposition to the increasingly powerful National Socialist Labour Party and their occultist-inclined Führer, who would go on to bring about World War II. After the war, Grau returned to Germany and resumed a career in commercial art until his death in 1971, at the ripe age of 87. Director F.W. Murnau went on to have an illustrious career and even emigrated to Hollywood in 1926, where he made Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, which cleaned up at the very first Academy Awards in 1927. He struggled with the adaptation of talkies in the late 20s though, as silent movies and the language of shadows was his preferred medium. He died in a car crash in Santa Barbara, California in 1931 at the tender age of 42. Though Max Schreck will forever be remembered for his role in Nosferatu, the movie wasn't a big hit at the time and it never got a wide contemporary release, so widespread fame eluded him. But he didn't really need it, as he was a working actor and well enough known among booking agents that he was never out of work. He would appear in numerous supporting roles in both film and in theatre, his first love, for the rest of his life. He died of a heart attack in 1936 at the age of 56. But though the people who made it had their time, the legacy of Nosferatu would live on. While the movie wasn't widely seen during its initial release, piracy and unsanctioned screenings would keep it alive and grow its reputation and influence over the future evolution of cinema in the decades to come. Beginning with modern established vampire lore, Nosferatu added that vampires will burn and die pretty quickly when exposed to sunlight, something which in folklore is more associated with trolls. Consider, even in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the only thing the sun did was weaken him, yet he was perfectly capable of strolling out in the sun. It was Nosferatu that confined vampires to the night. Also, the image of Nosferatu inspired the inhuman look of vampires we've seen in both Stephen King's Salem's Lot, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, Kindred the Embraced, What We Do in the Shadows, and most recently, The Last Voyage of the Demeter. In some of these, the Nosferatu are even a separate and very ancient species of vampire. The bigger influence of Nosferatu, though, was on the evolution of cinema itself. Nosferatu was an early example of German expressionism, with its highly stylized patterns and buildings and backgrounds of eerie, unnatural proportions, a style that would be further evolved in movies like Metropolis, and which would go on to inspire numerous later filmmakers, Tim Burton being a contemporary example. Also, alongside the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu would set the template for the modern horror movie. Murnau's language of shadows was also hugely influential, not just in the silent film era, but in much later movies. Nosferatu would also be remade, first by Werner Herzog in 1979, starring Klaus Kinski, not as Orlok, but as Dracula, because this time they secured the rights to the book, meaning many of Grau's occult themes were gone, replaced by more conventional vampiric lore. I already mentioned Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, released in 1992, the 70th anniversary of Nosferatu. That movie ironically owes almost as much to Nosferatu as it does Bram Stoker's original novel. Outside of the visual tribute to the form of the Nosferatu and Murnau's language of shadows, Coppola also inverted the tropes of German expressionism by making the costumes surreal while the sets and backgrounds were understated. That movie also ends with Mina Harker in a sense sacrificing herself in a manner evoking Ellen Hutter. This was unplanned though, as the movie originally ended like Stoker's novel, but due to the earlier build-up with Dracula as something of a hero, test audiences rejected that, forcing reshoots which, however unintentionally, owed more to Grau and Murnau than Bram Stoker. Lots of other movies reference Nosferatu as well, even in the form of satire.
Now she's dead.
No, she's not.
She's alive?
She's Nosferatu.
She's Italian?
Wait! If that was you on the phone and you on the bus, then who was flickering the lights? Nosferatu!
I mentioned earlier that there were many rumors surrounding Max Schreck, and a more jestful one from the decades after the movie was made, but before the internet made information about German film productions of the 20s readily available, was the notion that Max Schreck's performance as Orlok was so believable, and with a name like that, maximum horror, he had to have been a real vampire. No one seriously believed that, of course, yet this was the basis for the 2000 feature film Shadow of the Vampire, which presents a fictional account of the making of Nosferatu, in which Max Schreck, portrayed by Willem Dafoe, really is a vampire.
How dare you destroy my photographer! You idiot!
Did I kill some of your people, Murnau?
Why him, you monster? Why not the script girl?
The script girl. I'll eat her later.
For his performance, Dafoe was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. The movie also featured John Malkovich as Murnau, which this movie inaccurately portrays as the driving force behind Nosferatu. The real man with the plan, Albin Grau, still appears though, and he is portrayed by Udo Kier, who himself portrayed Dracula in Paul Morrissey's 1974 Blood for Dracula, also known as Andy Warhol's Dracula. But there's a fun twist with Udo Kier playing Albin Grau, whom you will recall is the one who popularized the staple that vampires will die when exposed to sunlight. Something Udo Kier also demonstrated in the perhaps most visceral way ever put on film, as he played the vampire who was executed by way of sunlight in the original Blade. But moving on. In 2016, director David Lee Fisher made an independent Kickstarter-funded remake starring Doug Jones as Orlok, though as of the making of this video, in September of 2024, it has no distribution and has only been screened in film festivals. 2024 also sees a big-budget studio remake from director Robert Eggers starring Bill Skarsgård as Orlok, which should expose whole new generations to the Nosferatu legacy. However, you can watch Prana Films' original Nosferatu right now, for free, right here on YouTube. And then you might as well watch our version, the Midnight's Edge Experience, which is all about preserving and enhancing the filmmaker's original vision, including by way of removing known mistakes. Let's take a moment to look at that. Murnau was all about the language of shadow and the visual experience. This is what he could control, and arguably where the vision of the director ended in the silent film era. Outside of the opulent premiere, which is the only occasion where Hans Erdmann's score composed for the movie is known to have been played, Murnau didn't even have control over the music, which would be much less orchestral at the various smaller venues, where the house band might easily decide to play something else entirely. Case in point, while the movie still exists, the full score written for it is long since lost to history, since the notes for it wasn't nearly as widely distributed. Any home media release which claims to feature Erdmann's original score is exaggerating, as what they actually have is a brand new score which incorporates the limited elements of the original score that still remains, but it's still no more legitimate than any newly composed score. Do note, however, that no silent movie was ever meant to be seen in complete silence. The filmmakers of the silent era still intended for there to be some kind of instrumentation to enhance the mood of the visuals on screen. The filmmakers not having complete control of what exactly the audience would hear, though, was par for the course. This was also true for the title and intertitle cards. As a general thing, the original intertitles were chopped off by distributors far and near, and replaced with the distributor's own intertitles, and oftentimes the distributors would in the process change some wordings, fonts, and even get some translations wrong, or otherwise add inconsistencies. Meaning, while the intertitles are part of the narrative in most cases, the exact form of the intertitles that remain today of the movies from this era aren't always indicative of the director's vision per se. No, the filmmaker's vision was restricted to the actual footage of the feature, and even there's a twist. Many today assume that most black and white releases were always black and white, because that is how they, for the most part, appear to us today. But ironically, just like silent movies aren't meant to be seen in silence, black and white movies from this era weren't meant to be seen in black and white. Through the power of tinting and hand coloring, some level of coloring was there since the very onset of cinema, and by the 1920s, by way of tinting, a whopping 80 to 90% of movies were in color, even if it was only one per scene. Still, that's how these movies were intended to be seen, with colored tints. A movie like Nosferatu, for instance, was never meant to be seen in black and white. So much of the movie takes place at night, and dusk and dawn are central as well, and the only way to visually present that in a time when even nighttime scenes had to be filmed in broad daylight due to the technical limitations at the time was with colored tints. On the whole, tint colors were used inconsistently. In some movies they indicate emotional states or atmosphere, but as a general rule of thumb, they provide the time of day and lighting conditions. Yellow, for instance, is daylight, while a darker yellow or sepia indicates indoor light at nighttime. Darkness or nighttime is usually blue, unless you're out in the forest at nighttime or out on the ocean, or there's an eerie tone to the scene. Then there might be a hint of green to that blue, while dusk and dawn, which are a tad more important in Nosferatu than many other movies, is pink. If the filmmakers of the 1920s really wanted to impress and blow the audience's mind, there would even be a mid-scene tint shift, like for instance a light being lit or extinguished. There are a couple of examples of that even in Nosferatu. But since movies were filmed in black and white and the colored tints were applied manually in a chemical process after the fact, mistakes were sometimes made, including in one French copy that would survive Florence Stoker's destruction, and which would be used as a tint reference in the two major restorations done on Nosferatu as of the making of this video. Most of the tinting mistakes in this French print were quite obvious and thus fixed in the 1995 restoration, but not all. More errors were fixed in the 2006 restoration, which is the source for nearly all Blu-ray releases available as of the making of this video. But in this 2006 restoration, some tinting errors that already had been fixed in the 1995 restoration were reintroduced, and now they live on in Blu-ray. In addition to these errors, which are now present in one restoration but not the other, both the 1995 and 2006 restorations missed an obviously intended mid-scene tint change. So even as good as those restorations were, as of the making of this video, there is still room for and even need for another. And until a proverbial final restoration can be made, we did one of our own. The Nosferatu Midnight's Edge experience is comprised of this retrospective plus our edition of the movie. For that, we used the tint corrections from both the 1995 and 2006 restorations as reference. Plus, we made the mid-scene tint change correction that both of those restorations missed, in addition to some other minor corrections here and there. Also, since the movie already is widely available on Blu-ray, with intertitle cards reconstructed to be as close to their original 1922 form as possible, we took the liberty of creating brand new cards based on our own translations of the original German intertitles, with designs intended to amplify the mood while being optimized for both big screen TVs and mobile devices alike, written in fonts which are classic, but which are as familiar and readable to audiences today as the original fonts were to the audience in 1922. Finally, we have also added some strategic sound effects, as well as our own score and instrumentation, which retains the classic feel, but which also draws on another century's worth of musical legacy to enhance Murnau's vision. Because that is our intention here, to preserve the original vision of director F.W. Murnau, producer Albin Grau, and writer Henry Galien, by putting their footage in a presentation that will give an audience unaccustomed to black and white cinema, let alone silent films, an immersive experience which simulates that of the audience who attended the opulent Berlin premiere in 1922. So, check out our full, unabridged version of Prana Films' Nosferatu by clicking the link in the description. Before you do that though, make sure to like this video, please help share it, and subscribe, indicating you want notifications on all videos, so you don't miss out on future in-depth ultimate retrospectives like these, because more will be coming. On that note, are there any movies in particular that you would like to see covered? Let us know which, as well as your thoughts on all things Nosferatu, in the comments.